This is 15 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006. I currently report for Utility. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is Michael Goggin, Vice President for Power System Consultant Grid Strategies, back for his third visit to the podcast because his research keeps making news. Michael's going to describe his new research, which shows the potential financial, environmental, legal, and political impacts for electricity users and the power system from the Trump Department of Energy's attempt to restart U.S. coal use in power generation. Michael's been Grid Strategies Vice President since 2018. His decades of research in transmission and clean energy optimization make him one of the nation's foremost power sector authorities. He's filed expert testimony over 100 times with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and state utility commissions. So, Michael, this year we've had the President's declaration of an energy emergency, DOE's use of emergency powers to keep two rundown coal plants running, and the flawed July DOE report calling for more baseload generation. Now there are concerns about the administration's use of the Federal Power Act, and especially Section 202C. How does that act and that section enable this coal revival that they're proposing?
Sure. So I'm not a lawyer. I should caveat that to begin with. But my understanding of the Federal Power Act and Section 202C is that it's historically been used for real emergencies, unexpected events, wartime events. That's kind of its history. And it's typically used for very short duration, to get through those emergencies. So if you have a hurricane or a heat wave or something, you might give a temporary waiver to a power plant to continue operating above its emission limits or something like that to kind of get you through that emergency, and then that's it. And what we're seeing now is a very unprecedented use of 202C. There have been 3 orders for fossil plants so far this year. The first 2 were in May for the Campbell coal plant in Michigan, and then the Eddystone oil and gas plant in Pennsylvania. And then just about a week ago, DOE reissued the Campbell one. Each of these orders is only 90 days. And so DOE has issued a new order for Campbell since the first 90-day order expired. And so that one is going to go out for another 90 days, and then we'll see if this keeps going. So those are the 3 that have come out that have kind of in this unprecedented use to basically step in. And what the Department of Energy is doing is effectively second guessing or overriding the decisions of the plant owners, as well as in the case of Michigan, the Michigan plant, the State Utility Commission. And you're also, what DOE is doing is effectively overriding the market decisions. Both of these plants, Campbell is in MISO, Eddystone is in PJM. The market price signals in the energy and capacity markets in MISO and PJM indicated that these plants were not economic. That's why the owners and, in Michigan's case, the state regulators decided that the plants should be retired. For the Campbell plant in particular, there was a very detailed integrated resource plan for consumers' energy. They determined that it was more economic to replace the plant with newer forms of generation, including gas, including renewables, including batteries. That determination was made years ago, and the utility was proceeding with that. And this is what this action is the Department of Energy kind of overstepping its authority and overriding those decisions that were very well reasoned and backed up by economics to keep a plant alive.
Excuse me, Michael. Sorry to interrupt you. We're going to talk about more about that in a minute. But before we leave this idea that the Federal Power Act 202C, I mean, it seems like this isn't the kind of emergency that was identified. I know you're not a lawyer, and this is something that has to be decided, I guess, by the courts. But this is a self-created emergency. The administration has taken steps to reduce access to generation. That seems like it's created the emergency. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, first I'd say that there is no emergency. These both of these areas have capacity markets, and you can look at the price signals in those. They are working. They are driving new resources to come in. If you look at the regional analyses, if you look at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation or NERC analyses, there is no emergency in either of these regions. So there is absolutely no emergency. I think you are correct, though, that if the administration were truly concerned about having enough supply of low cost energy and capacity, they would be not only allowing but promoting renewable resources and battery resources, because that's 90+% of what the market is trying to build today. And instead, we're seeing obviously actions in other realms of the administration, not just taking away tax credits for those resources, but also particularly for wind and solar, hobbling the ability to bring them online by enacting regulatory burdens and illegal permitting actions and other things. Anyway, that's a whole other topic for another day.
Yeah,
But it
exactly.
certainly
Yeah,
calls into question the legitimacy and the sincerity of this claim that there is a need for energy and capacity. Because the wind solar batteries work together to provide dependable energy, low cost energy. That's we can see compared to these fossil plants. It certainly performs extremely well, as MISO and PGM and other grid operators have documented in meeting their peak capacity needs. And so it's certainly contradictory for the administration to be, trying to prop up this uneconomic, unreliable, old type of generating resource. At the same time, it's doing everything it can to stop the economic and reliable new resources like wind, solar, and batteries.
and if our listeners have any doubts about that, you and Grid Strategy, other folks at Grid Strategies have done lots of research. And by the way, I've got a story coming out of Utility Dive that documents that pretty carefully, talking with a lot of really interesting experts about just what you were describing. But Michael, let's talk about your story on coal.
Mhm.
Your research has produced some really what I find startling numbers about how reopening retired or scheduled to retire coal plants could impact your electricity users. Tell us about those impacts. I mean, prices and so on. And as you're detailing those, what would electricity customers get for out of the deal? I mean, will reopening these coal plants or keeping scheduled to retire plants online improve system reliability or electricity costs?
So our analysis found that if DOE continues to issue 202C orders to plants that are scheduled to retire between now and the end of 2028, and that's all fossil plants. As I mentioned, they've done both the Campbell plant, which was a coal plant, and then the Eddystone, which was oil and gas. So we assume that all large retiring fossil plants, ones that currently are scheduled to retire, receive a 202C order. In that scenario, the cost would be about $3.1 billion. That's with a B, $3.1 billion per year
Well,
by the
wow,
end of 2028. If there's even more plants that are given these 202C orders to remain open, the cost could reach $5.9 billion per year. And we
that's
think that's
cost
a real
that's cost to electricity users. Is that what that is?
That's the ratepayer cost that is excess of you would pay that more on your electric bill to keep these uneconomic plants open. And that higher scenario that is based on a scenario in which plant owners see that there's this money available. And I think this is one of the real harms of this administration policy, is that it's creating a perverse incentive for plant owners to claim they want to retire so they can then get these ratepayer subsidies to keep the plant open, even though they might have kept it open anyway. And that's one of the real, I think, challenges and bad aspects of this policy, is that perverse incentive, because it's extremely challenging for the Department of Energy or any kind of general outsider to ascertain, is this plant economic or not? Does it really truly economically want to retire, or is it just saying it does to get this ratepayer subsidy? And that's the whole point of state regulatory authority, and why we have these very detailed proceedings to determine should plants retire or not. It's a very fact-finding and intensive process to make that determination. And the Department of Energy is not equipped to make that determination. They don't have access to the information.
We're
And
gonna go
so
on.
yeah, and so I
We're,
think there's a huge opportunity for a plant owner to abuse that process and get ratepayer subsidies by simply claiming they want to retire, even if they didn't before.
I understand, but and we're going to get to, well, I want to talk about federal versus state here
Mhm.
in a minute, but just one more thing about what you found in your research. Do customers get anything out of this deal? I mean, they're going to pay a lot more. Does it somehow improve system reliability in a way that we couldn't get from other resources? Or is there just anything besides maybe coal plant owners and coal mine owners, they get something presumably, but the customers get anything for this?
Certainly not a net benefit. It's going to be a large net cost for ratepayers. And that's because the entities that have the actual authority and the insight to make the call of should this plant retire or not have decided to retire those plants. As I mentioned in the case of consumers, every single entity involved, the plant owner, the utility, consumers, the regulator, the Michigan Utility Commission, the MISO market have all sent the signal, we don't need this plant. It's not economic, and that's why it was retiring. In all these cases, that's what's happening is everybody with the insight into the issue has decided this plant is not economic, it's not needed for reliability. It should be retired and replaced with new, more cost-effective, more reliable resources. And so what DOE is doing is essentially going to prop up this resource that is not a net beneficial source of reliability. It's not an economic source of reliability. And that comes at the detriment to those ratepayers, but also comes at the detriment to the market and the price signals it's going to send by keeping this uneconomic supply in the market. You're making it harder for new resources to come in. If you don't have orderly market exit, that impedes orderly market entry, which is how you bring in the new, more cost-effective, more reliable resources. And so you're going to be pushing power prices down, which it might sound like a good thing, but in the long term, it's not, because it's dissuading that market entry that you need in a healthy market to move to a new, more cost-effective, more efficient future power system. So yeah, and
Yeah.
ratepayers are not getting, it's certainly not a net beneficial thing. If it were, these utilities and other plant owners and their commissions would not have decided to retire these plants.
Yeah. So that brings us, first of all, I want, before ask my next question, I want to editorialize here for a minute.
Mhm.
And I know you understand this, and you described a bit of it. I've covered federal regulator processes and state regulator processes for 2 decades. One of the things you discover in watching how these things work is that they may not always reach perfect decisions, but they reach reasoned decisions based on the preponderance of evidence that's placed before them. And it's so easy for your Uncle Herman at Thanksgiving dinner to say, well, why don't they do this? And why don't they do that? Build more coal. But it's not that easy. And I think it's really important to stress that, Michael. But here's what I want to ask you. And it's a question that goes back to the 1780s and 1790s. This administration is trying to use federal leverage, and it's trying to impact the authority of state regulators who've gone through this careful process to determine what are the most economically viable resources. And they found wind, solar, batteries, natural gas to be much preferable. So, what's going to happen next? Do you think there's going to be lawsuits that can stop these decisions or bring them before courts uh, to decide who's the decision-making authority? And are we looking at the potential of the thin end of a wedge of between some sort of upheaval between federal and state authority?
Yeah, so there already is litigation. The Michigan Campbell plant order, there was a request for a rehearing filed by a number of parties back in June. After the Department of Energy did not respond to that within 30 days, those parties then took that into U.S. District Court. So there is ongoing litigation, and I've been engaged in that process. I submitted a public affidavit that outlines my views that are consistent with what I'm saying today. in that proceeding, and that's being led by the Michigan Attorney General and then a whole host of other groups. I was brought in by some of the environmental groups that are in that litigation. So it's being litigated there. I'm not sure. It's going to obviously take some time for these issues to play out in the courts. But you're absolutely right that this is a unprecedented intrusion into state authority. In the whole history of the power system in the U.S., the authority over generation decisions has been almost entirely at the state level. And that's just how our power system worked. And, it's obviously been a source of consternation at some points in time where we wanted, some states and utilities to move faster, but it's just how we've structured things. The federal authority is fairly limited over the electric sector in the United States. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has authority over reliability under Section 215, and then keeping rates just and reasonable under 206. And it does intervene to some extent in regional wholesale markets where states have granted some of their authority to that regional entity, like MISO or PJM, which is then subject to FERC regulation. But this Department of Energy 202C action is entirely outside of that realm. It's not even through FERC, and it's regulatory oversight. And again, the FERC oversight, these FERC regulated markets have been sending price signals for those resources to retire. So it's really not, FERC is, I mean, the Department of Energy is even is stepping into the realm of other federal agencies that actually do have the authority and do have insight into these matters. But the primary authority is with the state. And as you noted, I participate in a number of these state regulatory proceedings. The level of analysis and detail and data that's brought in there, and often it's particularly for a decision like this about retiring a plant, there's a tremendous amount of very confidential information about the plant and its economics and performance and all of that is commercially sensitive, but it's brought into those proceedings and used by the commission to make a determination of whether the plant should retire or not. The Department of Energy has the advantage of none of that. They don't have access to those proceedings. They weren't in them. And so it's really them stepping in and stepping on the toes of the entities that had the information and the authority to make these decisions.
Well, this is going to be left up to the courts, it appears, and
Mhm.
uh, that may be a viable recourse. We'll just have to wait and see. Michael, we have some time left. I
Mhm.
want to go over one other aspect of your research. Restarting coal could have some other very real implications besides just these huge billion-dollar numbers. Are there particular segments of customers that are going to be affected? And what about impacts on climate and health and water use? What can you tell us or summarize for us from your report about those things?
Sure. So the cost impact is very widespread. There's a map in the report, and we estimate that across 39 states and the District of Columbia, there will be likely some costs from these, and those are significant, across those, easily in the millions of dollars in all of those states. In many states, it's even larger. It's in the hundreds of millions in many cases, and this is distributed across red and blue states. A lot of it falls on red states. The MISO and the PJM regions. It looks like they're going to be broadly allocating these costs across their footprints, and so many of those are red-leaning states. Similarly, there's a lot of power plants in the Southwest Power Pool and in parts of the West that could receive these 202C orders and be forced to remain online against the wishes of their utilities and their commissions. And those are obvious, in most cases, those are red states. And so, interestingly, some of the only regions that are we think are unlikely to see these 202C orders are, New York, New England, primarily blue regions. So it's just, I think that's an interesting insight here is that this could, in fact, a huge swath of the country, but many of the president's supporters could be most affected here.
That's going
And
to have an immediate impact probably on their health and their water availability, their clean water availability, and it won't be so immediate to see how it impacts climate. But I interrupted you. Please
yeah, no,
continue.
and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not just the cost. I mean, coal is an uneconomic resource. That's why these plants are retiring. Even if you just look at it in isolation without even thinking about the environmental aspects. But yeah, obviously, if you begin to account for the air emissions and the water, pollution impacts, the water consumption impacts, it's large. And particularly for coal, a lot of these impacts are very localized. Particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, all of that is a very localized impact. Um, we're likely to see this to apply to gas and oil fire generators, like in the case of Eddystone, the plant in Pennsylvania. Those have a number of environmental impacts as well. From burning gas as well as producing the gas. Obviously, producing coal has a lot of environmental impacts, public health impacts. So yes, I mean that's all kind of layered on top of the cost. And so it's really just it makes this bad decision even worse when you start layering on all of the public health, environmental impacts on top of the consumer cost. And I think we focused a lot on the consumer cost because it's completely at odds with the President Trump's order that initiated this whole thing. In April, he issued this order saying to make America economically competitive and to for us to lead the world in artificial intelligence, we need to keep these power plants online. And bailing out uneconomic resources is not how you lead the world in economics, in developing AI, empowering your data centers. Every other country in the world is investing in renewables and batteries as quickly as they can. Increasing ratepayer costs by bailing out and subsidizing uneconomic resources is only going to drive up rates, which obviously hurts homeowners, business, small businesses. But if you're trying to run a data center on uneconomic coal resources, you're not going to compete with a plant, a data center in another country that's running on zero cost wind and solar.
Yep, yep, yep. And I happen to remember reporting many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, before the folks got a little bit of a handle on this, how badly coal ash in states like Tennessee and North and South Carolina affected the water reserves. But that's all the time we have, Michael. Let's leave it there. I want to thank my guest, Grid Strategies Vice President Michael Goggin, for describing the potential financial, environmental, legal, and political impacts on electricity users and the power system from a Trump administration restart of coal and power generation. And you'll be able to find that report at gridstrategiesllc.com. Michael's report is posted there. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and follow with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.